In this episode, we're talking about managing contractors and subcontractors, not just as a checkbox or a compliance exercise, but as a core part of running safe, successful projects. If you're an owner, a manager, or a safety professional working in construction, oil and gas, or the energy sector, this conversation matters. Because when contractor management isn't done well, the consequences show up fast. Safety incidents, project delays, cost overruns, and strained relationships. But when it's done well, it becomes a competitive advantage. That's why I'm excited about today's guests. Joining me are Jill and Heather, the minds behind the Contractor Safety Management Program at EPCOR, a program that became known as best in class. Not because it looked good on paper, but because it worked in the real world. In this episode, we break down the step-by-step approach they created and implemented, from how it started, to how it scaled, to how it delivered real results. But we also go deeper than process. We talk about relationships and understanding contractor businesses, and about why getting to know the people behind the work is just as important as the systems you build. So, if you're responsible for contractors in any capacity, this is a conversation you don't want to miss.
And there's a saying, the contractor you have to work with is the contractor you have to work with.
So you said best in class. How did you know you had built something that was successful?
We would have other organizations reaching out.
We increased engagement with the contractors. So
you can't always rely on the report card or the scorecard that's coming in.
So we've talked a lot about contractor management and the tools you guys use. It's really common for a lot of organizations just to say, do you have core? And if you have core, you're good enough for us to hire, and we assume you've got a quality safety program. There's obviously a big difference there between doing that and what you guys were doing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and why just settling for core isn't enough, and that you've got to look at other aspects of the safety program to ensure that you're bringing on quality vendors and quality contracts? If you think back to the beginning, what pulled you into the safety world? Was there a moment in your career where you thought, this is it, I love doing safety, this is where I belong? Heather, why don't we start with you?
Well, safety is actually my second career. So I started out in healthcare as a prosthetist, making prosthetic arms and legs. And I was working in a private facility in Red Deer. And it was a house that had been converted into a clinical space upstairs and a technical space in the basement. And just to paint the picture, all of the windows were painted shut. And there was one staircase down into the basement. And there was absolutely no ventilation, no dust extraction, no controls of any sort. And I remember, in this workspace being exposed to chemicals and particulate and everything in a very small space. And I started developing nosebleeds that I've never had nosebleeds before in my life. And I remember saying, there has to be something better than this. And so that's what initiated my interest in safety. So I registered at Red Deer College. It was the extension program for U of A for the Occupational Health and Safety Certificate. And from there, it took off. And so, I've had personal experiences where I felt that health and safety was not being managed within the workplace. And that's, initiated a intuitive interest or, an intrinsic interest, I would say. Jill, what's your story?
Yeah, all right. Yeah, not sure I can top that. I didn't wake up one day and think, man, safety is where I belong. I think it evolved over time. So safety found me, I would say, in that when I had kids and they were little, and I had a husband who worked out of town and would come home and he would share stories about what he would experience on the work site. He came home one day with a really bad burn to the back of his leg as well. And I said, do you tell anybody that that's what happened at work? And the answer to that was no, you don't. And you keep it to yourself and you deal with potential infections with burns on the job site. And so that's probably where it started for me. And similar then, you look at how can I make a career out of this, and went through the certificate program through the U of A and have landed now here. This is not the path that I had set out for myself at all. But this is the path that I took.
Nice. That's very interesting. Well, why don't we talk a little bit about your guys' time at EPCOR? Both of you worked on and built their contractor safety management program. And can you explain how the program came to be? How did you know what you had created something successful?
I'll start. I was there ahead of Heather, and I'm still with EPCOR. The program existed, so there definitely was a contractor safety management program at EPCOR. The challenge was that it was embedded within each individual business unit, and so the application of it kind of ranged from soup to nuts. And so when Heather joined, we realized that if the representation from each business unit could come together and build a program that was more central based, then we would deviate from that siloed approach within the business units. And that's the mentality that we took as we kind of rebuilt the program. We opened up the standard, we opened up the procedures, and said, like, what's working well here versus what's working well there, and what are the current best practices that we can throw into the program, and then really look at it from that central viewpoint.
And Jill was with a business unit that was kind of the base business of EPCOR, where I was in a business unit that had been recently acquired. So the contractor safety management program, and I'm using that term loosely, essentially didn't exist in the business unit I was in. And the organization recognized that this was an area of very, very high risk, not only because of the nature of the work being performed, because it was predominantly ground disturbance, working from heights, confined space entry, lots of atmospheric hazards. And, these are the things that, as Todd Conklin will say, are sticky. Like, it's the shit that will kill you. So at least the organization respected and recognized that they didn't want to invite risk in the door. So, there was a priority given towards contractor safety management. And we were basically given carte blanche where we could build a program, that would meet the needs, obviously, for the organization legislatively, but really, designed to be best in class. And I think that that's what we accomplished after a number of years of, trial and error. But yeah, I think we got to a place where, we were very proud of the program we'd developed.
Yep.
And there were other people on our team, so it wasn't the Heather and Jill show, but sometimes it was.
Yep. Yeah.
So you said best in class. How did you know you had built something that was successful?
We would have other organizations reaching out to say, can you share your program with us? Like, what does it look like? What does your onboarding process look like for contractors? So could we hand over the procedure as it stood? No. But we could articulate what those best practices were. Yeah.
And I think that there's other things that you could look at metrics, right? Like lagging indicators. Okay. So it's easy to see, when the infancy of the program came online, the TRIF was whatever it was. We saw that number decrease over the years, but it's a lagging indicator. So then you ask the question, well, what were we doing to drive that down? And so, we increased engagement with the contractors. So Jill and I would often do a contractor orientation, and it was an open invitation to all the contractors across our business units. And we would have 400 or 500 participants come to these, where they're hearing consistent messaging, they're understanding the requirements, basically the rules of engagement. So we're able to establish the relationships. That was a key part of it. Another piece was we started to really implement the Plan, Do, Check, Act. So we asked for the evidence that they could prove to us, or due diligence of being able to perform the work safely. So we'll get into some of those key elements in a bit, but, instead of just taking their word for it, we would say, well, show us your safe work procedures, show us your policy, show us your training records, so that we could verify that they could actually do the scope of work that they were hired to do safely. When your project is run safely, then there's other evidence that shows up. So there was a reduction in change requests. There was a reduction in project overruns or schedule creep, or those other kind of negative outputs when projects aren't managed correctly. So it's like an investment. So with safety, you either pay up front or you pay down the line. And so we were establishing these upstream processes that then set up the projects for success.
And I'll just clarify, it wasn't Heather or I doing that legwork necessarily. It also took a lot of work with our project management team, construction coordinators, to get them bought into the program to say, like, this is your contractor. Like, I can tell you what the requirements are, but you actually need to be managing the contractor. And so building relationships, not just with the contractors, but with our internal stakeholders as well, so that they really, truly understood why this program existed.
And to leverage that, we also built partnerships with our procurement teams. In the past, I think the practices were, it was more like a checkbox exercise where procurement would say, oh, there's a safety requirement, and we will weight it at 10% of the overall tender scoring. And there would be some nominal criteria, but we were able to work with procurement to say, you know what, there's a need to bolster that, to make it a little bit more robust, so that we're measuring the right things, so that we can weed out the contractors who aren't going to be able to perform the work safely. So we were able to evolve that process as well and be a partner in the whole procurement process, which was critical.
All right. If you had to break down contractor management into 4 to 5 key points, what would you highlight as the most important steps and why?
I wonder if we looked at each other in the eyes and labeled them together, if we would nail it.
I'm sure we would. We have a workflow process for this, actually.
Yeah, yes. So if I had to narrow it down to 5, the first one would be to identify the scope of work and set the expectations, or what your expected outcome looks like for any project. Then you'd get into pre-qualification and contractor selection. Mobilization, the pre-mobilization steps ahead of that. Then we switch into that work in progress piece. And then finally, the feedback. And so feedback, whether it's back to the contractor, back to the project manager, to let them know how the work went. I think that's key.
And then to get into it a little bit more as to what each of those elements look like. So in defining the scope.
But did I get them right?
You did. You
Yes.
nailed it.
Yes.
But defining the scope of work is so critical. And I'll share a story in a bit to explain or to put it into practice. But this is where the owner or the organization who's hiring a contractor has to clearly define what they expect to have completed. Because the contractor is then going to create their bid or their tender to match that scope of work. And, I'll give the example of we hired a contractor to do an electrical distribution upgrade project. And they prepared their bid, they submitted, but what they failed to do was come to the pre-bid walkthrough, which would then show what had to be done. On the owner's side, I think that the scope wasn't fully developed. So the scope actually did include an element of ground disturbance. And the contractor had no qualifications to perform ground disturbance work. They didn't have anybody trained to do it. And so their bid didn't reflect, the what they'd have to implement in order to do that work safely. So the scope being defined upstream, early and clearly is really, really important. And then to that, the owner has to assign the risk level, because that will then inform what requirements have to be met before the work can actually start. So also included in that first step is having really well-defined contractor safety requirements. So again, that sets the standard of the behavior that's expected, the deliverables, as well as the rules of engagement. So it essentially becomes kind of like a policy that the contractor has to follow.
So yeah, then you get into what the minimum requirements are for a contractor to attend work on the work site, what they need. But the key piece in that, and I think that this is something that's often overlooked, is you can't always rely on the report card or the scorecard that's coming in. And you have to stay curious and open-minded with any contractor that bids on work. And what I mean by that is you might have, the larger organizations, and on paper they look really solid and great. And they might have a really low TRIF, and you think like, this is the perfect contractor to go with. But they might not have the fully developed program in, say, ground disturbance that you might need. On the flip side of that, you might have a really small organization who's really good at what they do, but their TRIF might be like, you look at it and it's like 17.3, and you're like, how does that happen? And people are saying, oh, you can't use them, their TRIF is much too high. When really, if you just get a little bit curious and you ask the questions like, why is your TRIF 17.3? And you find out that it's because they don't have a claims management team. They don't have people dedicated to make sure that injuries are dealt with at the field level. And instead they snowball into a medical treatment. And therefore one injury results in a TRIF of 17.3. I think it's super critical to be, as I say, open-minded, be curious, ask those questions, and work with those contractors to say, well, what can you implement to accompany your bid package here that closes the gap that we might be seeing? You might end up with better quality work and the better contractor for this scope that you're needing to hire out for, as opposed to the A-graded on paper contractor. So I think that's key. And I think that that's something that is often missing when we're looking at that pre-qualification step in this process.
And I had a contractor once who had a TRIF of 41.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
And you're like, we'll never hire them. But in being curious, I found out that they just couldn't do the math.
Oh, yes.
Math is
yes.
hard.
And
Right?
it can be.
They didn't have the right denominator in the TRIF calculation. So that was quickly remedied. But yeah, sometimes you can't look at it at face value. But in being curious, there's also a lot of opportunity to, find information that's out in the public space. So you can Google companies and find out, some information. Also, the government of Alberta has a platform called Search an Employer. And from there, you can actually pull up any organization who has a WCB account, and you can see what their history has been. It doesn't necessarily show you this year because there's a bit of a lag, but you can also verify the numbers that they're providing to you against what the government knows to be true. So, there's lots of different ways you can get the information, but in the pre-qual, that's looking at their industry performance, and it gives you kind of a 10,000-foot view of how they've performed relative to their competition. So that's where you can compare apples to apples, but it doesn't tell the full story.
You were talking about pre-qualification. Are you doing that pre-qualification on a per project basis? Or are you doing it on an annual basis, on a quarterly basis? How are you pre-qualifying these contractors?
All of the above.
All of the above, okay.
But per project. And so you might have the same contractor submitting another bid package, and you just reviewed one last week, but you're going to review it with a fresh set of eyes and not use your previous knowledge of the contractor in today's bid review, if that makes sense.
So then the next step is pre-mobilization. So we've now ruled out, or we've been able to get to the awarded contractor who hopefully has scored the highest across whatever the criteria may be.
And especially safety.
Especially safety. And we'll come back to weightings in a second. But with pre-mobilization, this is now looking at their readiness to work safely. So this is the awarded contractor. They're going to do the scope of work. We've seen what their industry performance looks like, but now we want to see how they're going to perform this scope of work. So that's where we would ask for the pre-mobilization package, where they need to provide their pre-job hazard assessment, their site-specific emergency response plan, all their training certificates, their safe work practices, codes of practice, whatever's relevant to that scope of work. And then essentially in the roles that we had, we'd be performing a desktop audit on their administrative controls. And more often than not, we would find huge gaps or deficiencies. And again, we've said this word a few times, we're going to say it many more. It's all about the partnership. So we would work with the contractors to close those gaps because they've already been awarded. And there's a saying, the contractor you have to work with is the contractor you have to work with. And so you need to have that relationship to help them elevate their performance so that they can perform that work safely and without any additional risk. So pre-mobilization is a really, really key step that has to be performed before anybody is, boots on the ground. And only when that has been done to the standard accepted by the owner can the work start.
So you said you would help coach them to bring them up to your standards. What type of coaching were you doing? Were you providing them with documentation, or were you just, you need to fix this, walking away?
Well, for example, one contractor had a fall protection code of practice, and in it said that they only needed to wear fall protection once they were working from a height of 30 feet. Well, that doesn't fly in Alberta. So their code of practice was incorrect to start with. So there was a coaching opportunity here to say, actually, the legislation says 3 meters. And, there's other things that you need to have in place as well. So you're not relying just on, wearing a harness. There's other controls. So it's really a conversation, a dialogue about what are the requirements, what do you have as a solution, and then making sure that your documentation reflects that. Now, documentation is just an administrative control. So then there's the other parts about how it's implemented with the team who's actually performing the work. So now you have to get people trained, you have to have the right PPE, you need to have the proper inspections, like equipment inspections and so forth.
And we would ask for completed inspection reports. So not just your template document, but the actual completed inspections or, a sample size of whatever it is you're asking for. And if their program said, we do this on this frequency and this is the template that we use, but they couldn't demonstrate that, that would be part of that feedback too, to say you're not even following your own program here. So, and we're catching that, right? So, and we're going to hold you to it. I'll just go back to the pre-qualification piece. So, I've been involved in projects that have been quite large and, year over year, and we're looking at maybe a 5-year contract, for a specific scope of work. And, I've also seen where the organization has taken the quantifiers, so the RFP scoring, and they've added the qualifiers through an interview. And so that's where you'll invite the senior leadership team of the organization for a face-to-face interview. And I would be involved in that because I would be assessing the health and safety questions that we would be asking. I always threw in the caveat, though, that we're going to get into health and safety, but your health and safety representative, whether it's their director or senior leader, they're not allowed to answer the question. I wanted the operational managers to answer the safety questions. And that would be quite telling too, as to where an organization is in their health and safety journey. Can operational leaders answer questions about safety? We know the safety team can probably give the textbook answer, but can the operational leaders give that answer as well? And so then there'd be some weighting reserved for that too. It was interesting because you'd get people saying what? What do you mean safety can't answer the safety questions, right? But it's quite effective, quite effective.
So we've touched on the pre-mobilization.
Yeah, so the work in progress piece is more of that Real-time auditing of their safety program. So doing those field checks, making sure that if they say they perform inspections weekly, that they have that documentation on site. If we've got the lockout, tagout, auditing that program in real time, and providing that feedback both to the contractor, but also to your owner representative to say, like, this has been my finding. Either we need to pull the contractor in for a conversation or we send kudos. We can do that too. So, it's about not handing the contract to the contractor and saying, like, my work here is done. No, your work here is not done.
It's just begun.
It's just begun. A lot of work has gone into the process up until this point, but it's also good to manage the contractor in this stage too. So it's that field presence, that visible safety leadership, and getting, and it's not safety doing this. Like I need to reiterate it. This is not safety doing this. This is, safety saying, like, hey, let's do this audit inspection together. And you're pulling in your project manager, your construction coordinator, whoever is representing the project from the organization that you're working for, and doing that hand in hand. And it's a teachable moment too, to say, this is what we're going to do and this is why it's important.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you're doing it while the work is progressing. You're not waiting. It's very common for these programs to wait till the project is over to then conduct that closeout audit and say, late. Oh no, these are all these gaps. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Well, yeah, it's the project's over. Nobody cares, right? The project manager wants to close this project and move on. The company that's done the job just wants to get paid. So yeah, I like that work in progress. It's important to do it while the work is going on to catch those gaps.
And one of the things that I did, and it became an initiative for that particular year, was doing evaluations on the contractors' emergency response plans. And in the business unit I was in, again, ground disturbance and working from heights was a big one, and working in confined spaces. But the exercise that I would have the contractor demonstrate would be a confined space rescue. And again, we're talking about very high risk work. So this was such an important piece of their emergency management plans, but also a great return on investment. So if you exercise that, then, you're building the muscle memory. And so if there is a catastrophic outcome or incident, then at least, you know that they're prepared to do the steps to do the rescue. So that was the theme for a whole year. Every month I would visit a different contractor site and they would demonstrate this. So it wasn't a cold exercise. Like, they had warning and they were able to prepare for it accordingly.
But the most important part with that too is the feedback, to say this is what went well and this is maybe what didn't go so well, right? And here are the gaps that we identified in this exercise program. So you don't just show up with your clipboard one day and say, okay, here's the exercise, let's do this. Very, very inclusive environment with the conversations and the lead up and the planning. Nothing was a surprise. And the feedback at the end also should not be a surprise.
And it wasn't an enforcement activity at all. It was, an opportunity to learn, opportunity to be better. And again, back to the partnerships, it worked really, really well. So they knew we were there to support them and they wanted to do the best work they could because it helps them secure future work.
Exactly.
Yeah. So then the last step in the workflow is the, we'll call it post-project evaluation or annual evaluation if it's a multi-year project or service agreement or whatever it may be. And so we would set up these meetings with the contractor to, again, go through a scorecard. So this was done with procurement and we would evaluate them on a number of different metrics. But then they could see how they had been assessed by us and how it could potentially set them up for future success. So we would often give them opportunities for improvement. And then this became an input to subsequent RFPs. So we could use past performance as a criteria for future performance.
And what's interesting too, so I was in the program long enough to see year over year results of the feedback that we'd be giving contractors. And we were seeing an increase in that score. It was getting better, right? And you think like, wow, actually it's actually worth it, right? To see their score go up instead of going down. We're only just speaking from the health and safety aspect portion of the overall scorecard, where they talked about like compliance to schedule and their project team and whether or not they were under or over budget or whatever, right? But yeah, we were seeing improvement in the health and safety score with some of our repeat contractors.
And another thing was that this whole program, so, after a few years of implementation, what we were seeing was a divide from the contractors that we had hired in the beginning to the contractors we were hiring a few years later, in that the program and the process weeded out the low performers. Like that was tangible. Mm-hmm. And so, the word got out in industry that if you didn't invest in safety, then you weren't going to be awarded the work. And, people were hungry to work for EPCOR. And so we saw this shift in the industry where contractors were now starting to up their game because they wanted to be competitive in the RFPs. They did want to get awarded the work. And so kind of all the contractors came up. So there were always the high performers who consistently got awarded the work. But then we saw this elevation in the other contractors that they wanted to be competitive as well. Yeah. So that was, kind of a qualitative outcome of the success of the program.
Yeah. And selling that success, being able to see that success at EPCOR is a telltale way for other organizations to go out there and say, this is a program that works. And yes, you're going to invest up front, but the return you're going to get on the back end with the quality of contractors you now bring in and the quality of vendors that you now bring to the table, the ease for the project management staff to manage those contractors because they already know what the standard is. They're not coming in, starting a project, fumbling their way through it, getting the job done, not doing the paperwork, not doing the administrative side of things. So showing that success, that's the sell point. That's the commitment from management saying that's what you're going to end up with when we're done, which is valuable.
And it's not rocket science. And, Jill and I have done a number of seminars in industry. We've done lots of presentations to contractor groups. And, we've lived it. It's easy for us. But there's so many organizations out there that have no understanding of contractor safety management. Mm-hmm. And so many organizations are still awarding work to the lowest cost bidder. It still happens today, which is mind-blowing because that is guaranteed to have negative consequences. And
my biggest pet peeve is, especially for organizations like myself, we pre-qualify for 3 to 5 years and you don't follow up with us at all in that process. So you don't know if my program's gotten better, my program's gotten worse. You don't know if my staff have changed over and I'm putting different people with different experience on site. You're not asking those questions. And then in that window, if the legislation changes, you're not following up to see, if improvements have been made, are we meeting the legislation, or if just industry standard has changed. Mm-hmm. We're seeing a big push right now with industry standard where there's a role for the safety professional, there's a role for the hygienist, there's a role for the engineer, there's a role, all these different roles, and workplace health and safety is now enforcing it. But I'm on a pre-qual list with 5 other people. Maybe 3 of them don't fit those roles anymore, right? Because of how that change is made. And so seeing that pre-qualification done per RFP, following up with your contractors for that continual improvement ensures that if legislation changes or best practices change or anything like that changes, you're capturing that right away while you're doing that program. And you're not waiting for, the 5-year term is up. Let's re-audit everybody and hope that everyone lifts their boots up now.
Well, and that's another pitfall, I guess, of the whole industry is, and Jill touched on it briefly, that a lot of owners think that they can just assign prime contractor and then absolve themselves of all the responsibility as it relates to contractor management. And that is so far from the truth. And, we know in the legislation that there's very clear defined obligations for all worksite parties, and the owner still retains a lot of responsibility and accountability. So just assigning prime contractor off to the contractor shouldn't be done freely. It shouldn't be done without serious consideration, because the risk is still there. And, I think we say this often, that you can't just assign prime contractor and walk away from it. You can't.
No, and it's surprising, even now in 2025, how many organizations still don't understand how prime contractor works. And we see it all the time. And a lot of the stuff we teach, the 2-day asbestos course, the health and safety legislation, things like that, we actually take the time to talk about prime contractor, because people just think, especially property owners, just, no, I've hired him, he's prime, I don't have to do anything, I'll meet with him once a month or once a week to make sure the project's going smoothly. Yeah, but you have more responsibilities than just meeting with them to make sure the project's going smoothly. Yeah. Have you done a hazardous materials assessment on your building? Do you understand what your tenants are doing in that property? Do you understand how this work can affect other tenants or other contractors on site? So they just, and we see it a lot is, I hired this guy to do work over here, they're both prime. Well, wait a minute, this guy's got to shut the power off to the entire building, which affects what this guy is doing. You can't assign 2 primes. You need 1. And we see that all the time. And
it was interesting because we were in different business units, but the work was very unique. So in Jill's business unit, they retained prime. So EPCOR retained prime more often than not. In my business unit, we assigned prime more often than not, but very different work environments and different scopes. So it depends on the situation, but you need to be very, very aware of what the scope of work is, where it's being conducted, and then make the decision from there. Also, understanding if the contractor can fulfill the obligations of prime contractor. Sometimes they can't.
Yeah, there's a lot of management when it comes to prime contractor, and most of it is administrative and paperwork, and a lot of organizations don't understand what that entails and the volume that it can entail. We've worked with a lot of contractors on year-long, 2-year-long projects where they have an administrative team of 4, 5, 6 people. That's all they're doing. Processing paperwork, processing documentation in relation to prime contractor, because there's such a volume of it. You've got all your sub-trades. I got to see all their inspection work. I got to see what their safety, not just inspection for the work, but safety paperwork and their project management paperwork, their weekly meetings, all of that funnels through the prime contractor. It's a lot to manage.
And if there's any gray area in that process, we all know that can then default back to the owner, and people don't realize that. And there's danger in establishing this prime over prime as well, that if you're going to go in and start directing the work of the prime contractor, you're pulling that title to yourself, and you shall not do that, right? So, but not too many people know that, but that's why we have organizations that have dedicated people for contractor safety management who can educate the team to say, like, these are sort of the do's and don'ts of what you're headed into, and not to put the fear of any God into people, but it's that education piece.
Yeah, and you're seeing more of the contractors, especially the bigger ones. They have an entire unit devoted to project management. Yeah. They'll come in, they'll take prime, they'll project manage it all for you, and then they'll turn around and sub out the work to the appropriate trades that can come in and do it. And so that, if you're an owner that doesn't have that capability or capacity, there are organizations out there that can do that role for you. So
Yeah. So, there's often a PMO with large companies. And Jill and I were championing for many years there that we wanted a CMO, a contractor management office, because the need is there. And especially for an organization of that size, projects are happening day in, day out. Capital projects, like big scale, multi-million dollar, high risk. And so it certainly warranted a CMO. But the idea never took off, which was unfortunate.
We tried.
We tried.
Yeah, we tried.
So we've talked a lot about contractor management and the tools you guys use. It's really common for a lot of organizations just to say, do you have core? And if you have core, you're good enough for us to hire, and we assume you've got a quality safety program. There's obviously a big difference there between doing that and what you guys were doing. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and why just settling for core isn't enough, and that you've got to look at other aspects of the safety program to ensure that you're bringing on quality vendors and quality contracts?
Yeah, we love talking about core. So just as a, basic understanding, an employer with 20 or more employees must have a defined health and safety program. So that's a legislative requirement. Then there's the certificate of recognition, which, I think is misunderstood to be the upper echelon of safety performance. And to be very clear, if you achieve 100% on a core audit, you've actually just met ground level. That is basic compliance.
The bare minimum.
The bare minimum.
Yeah.
So often, Jill and I would be evaluating contractors, and they would have a core and they would promote that they got a 98%. And we didn't really put a lot of stock into it.
Like hardly at all.
Like none. We evaluated other things that told us more information, but the process is an evaluation. So it's an audit and it's a snapshot in time. Sure. So it's a process, but it doesn't mean that contractor is a high performer. That's why we had to look at other pieces to get the full story.
Yeah, like show me.
Yeah.
Show me. Give me evidence that you do what core says that you say you do.
Or your program says that you're doing. Yeah. Well, and it's very much like ISO. ISO audits your system that says, here's how we do things, but it doesn't audit, are you actually doing things the right way? It just, your program said you were going to do X, Y, and Z. Are you doing X, Y, and Z? You're doing X, Y, and Z. Everything's good. But there's nothing in that system to go, is X, Y, and Z the right actual steps for you to be doing, or the things you should be doing? Or are you missing a W? Are you missing a P in there that you should be doing that you've completely neglected? And so doing that little extra with your vendor management program captures those gaps, not just saying, okay, you've met the bare minimum, but you've met the bare minimum and plus.
Exactly.
Yeah, nothing was a secret. Very transparent on what requirements were when we were asking for bid submissions to come in. And of course, there's always that Q&A timeline as well, where contractors could be asking questions. What do you mean by this? Like, what does this element within the safety requirement mean? And we would respond appropriately to that. And and had success.
When talking about contractor management, you guys talked a lot about the collaborative work that you would do with everybody. So there's obviously a big difference there between, when I started in the industry in the 90s, we were very much safety cop, do as I say, not as I do. I'm here to yell at you for you're doing everything wrong, versus the traditional safety professional now, where we're out there mentoring, training, working with all the different people to go that way. Can you talk about maybe that shift in EPCOR's mentality as you guys work through this?
Yeah, in my time with EPCOR, I don't think I was ever hired as a safety cop. So
Okay.
The organization is quite evolved in that regard. The health and safety team are relied upon as strong resources, subject matter experts, where really it is about collaboration. It really is about, it's not safety versus production. It's safety with production, of safe production, safe operations. And it is a hand-in-hand approach. I will go with you and we will do this together, whether it's, the task of doing a worksite inspection or navigating the health and safety world. And so that's been refreshing for me. And that's why I'm still with that organization, to be honest with you, is that it is the right fit for me. I do, and my role is now in operations. And so seeing health and safety from the operational lens offers new perspective too, which I'm appreciating big
And
time.
to your point, we've seen an evolution in the profession where the job title has gone from officer to advisor. And so just in the nomenclature and just in the naming of the roles, it gives that sense of, we're here to help, we're here to advise and guide. And so that's across the profession, not just for contractor safety management. But, we have this real opportunity to build relationships, to encourage people or companies to perform their best work. And, it's just way more satisfying to do it that way as opposed to, writing citations. I never got into the profession to be a safety cop. That doesn't appeal to me at all. And then, it's just so rewarding and satisfying when you see whether it's an internal partner or an external partner perform that work safely and uh, for the benefit of their employees. So it's not about me, it's about everybody who's actually performing the work.
It's coaching, not catching.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're getting away from the gotcha moments to the, okay, we've realized we've got a problem here. How can we go from, step A to step B to step C to get you to improve over time while we're working on these jobs? And it's a lot different.
And there's other elements that have come into the profession. Now we're talking about psychology. We're talking about values. We're talking about, behavior and culture and trying to integrate those into the work that's being done. So it's the soft aspect of safety now. So it's not just, are you doing it correctly? And, writing a ticket or not writing a ticket. It's about, why are you doing it that way? And how can we link that to your personal values such that you want to do it safely?
Yeah, and we're getting away from, again, when I started in the 90s, the KPIs were all around, they were all lagging. It was all, we did an audit, we found a mistake, we did an audit, we found a mistake, we went on site, we saw a deficiency. And now we're talking more and more about those leading KPIs, which can tell us, okay, wait a minute, we had 5 incidents last month. They were all around the same issue. We need to look at that, go back and figure out why we had those 5 similar issues, solve that problem before it gets worse. And very, very different from when I started in the industry, because we weren't even looking at those leading indicators or having conversations about them. It was all just reactive safety. And like we talked about before, proactive is becoming much more popular because organizations realize it costs a lot of money to have a job shut down for 6 weeks. They're not getting paid. Their staff are still doing work, but they're not getting reimbursed for it. The organization they're working for is now frustrated. Do I ever want to hire this company ever again when they've cost me 6 weeks or however long it is? And so that proactiveness hopefully helps to take that risk away or more of that risk away as we continue to move towards proactiveness. So what's one story about contractor management that completely changed the way you approach safety today?
I think for me, I recall a young worker who unknowingly entered into a confined space, and the conversations after that, like I think the guy even lost his job because he should have known better, but he didn't know what he didn't know. And you look at that, and from the perspective that I had, you look at that and you kind of scratch your head and be like, how did we get here? Like, how is that his fault? Where did his employer set him up for success or failure? But then as the organization that hired the contractor, that hired the subcontractor, like, where did we fail, right? And I think that really stuck with me, and that sits in the back of my brain to say, Like, people really don't know what they don't know. And if I know something that you don't know, it's my duty to inform you and to educate you on where we are today and how we can prevent situations like this in the future and how we can learn from them and grow. So I think that was probably one of the biggest learnings in my career path.
Yeah, people don't choose to set out and work unsafely. Like, where was the failure in the system?
Yeah.
To go back to the example I shared earlier about this contractor that found themselves doing a ground disturbance scope of work. And I'm going to answer your question not on what changed my view of safety. I'm going to say it's reinforced my view of safety. So this contractor was doing the ground disturbance work, had an excavation, struck a sanitary service, and that then resulted in a work stoppage. The investigation commenced. So I was asked to come out to the work site to observe what was going on. And as I approached the site, I saw the excavation, which was approximately 8 feet deep. And there were 2 hard hats that I could see just below the surface. And there was not any evidence of a protective system at all. So in addition to that, there was a spoil pile right on the edge of the excavation. And there was no control zone. So, we have ground disturbance, we have a restricted space, we have a fall hazard, we have all the things that give safety professionals a heart attack. So I asked these 2 workers to come out, and they tootle off wherever they were going. But with the site superintendent representing the contractor, I started to ask the questions. And so there was no evidence of a ground disturbance permit. There was no evidence of any training whatsoever. There was no hazard assessment. There was no safe work practice. There was nothing. And the superintendent was looking at me like I had 3 heads. Like, what are you asking for? We need what? And so that again was the moment where it reinforced that the work we do is very, very important. And, we're the champions of safety. We're the advocates. We're the interpreters, and we're working with, whether it's contractors or internal staff, we're working with them to help them understand why we need to work safely. So, based on the risk, we make risk-based decisions. So, that was a lengthy process, but the project was stood down for, I want to say, about 6 weeks until they could implement the appropriate controls in order to perform that work safely. So it was an impact to our operations, and the leadership was fully supportive of it. But it's just, again, that reinforcement that we need to provide the coaching, we need to provide the support, because otherwise the potential for the negative outcome is real. Like, that excavation could have collapsed.
Yeah, and then it begs the other questions, were locates not done properly? How
there
did
were
you?
no locates.
So questions like that, they've obviously never heard the stories. Like as an environmental consultant, we do a lot of environmental drilling. My first week coming out of university with my first employer was all the horror stories of all the drill jobs that went wrong, so that I don't make those mistakes when I go out. And the first is, someone didn't do their locates. They drill through a Cat 5 or like a telephone line, and you basically go in there and you repair that little line by little line by little line, which costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to do that repair. And like you say, the project is shut down for weeks, so first thing we go through is all the horror stories so we don't make those mistakes, the injuries that happen when using a drill rig, the incidents for if you don't do your locates properly, what's going to go on, why you need to understand if you're doing a reclamation project and you are digging holes, what depths can you go to before you've got to start to slump your sides, where do you want to put your waste soil before while you're working. And so it surprises me someone who would operate a backhoe hadn't heard those stories and maybe thought of asking some questions before a hole was dug.
Unfortunately, it's more common than you think.
Yeah, it's scary when you think about it. When you start to think about how many people the program weeded out versus how many people the program keeps, it makes you ask a lot of questions. All right, well, that's the interview today, but we've got one sort of golden question we want to ask all of our guests. And just for a little bit of fun, if you could set the record straight on one common misunderstanding about safety, what would it be?
I'm going to sound like a broken record. You can't assign prime contractor and think that you are free and clear of all the risks. There's a lot of work that goes into assigning prime contractor.
Yeah, that's very profound. Yeah. I think I'd probably leave you with this, and that is that safety doesn't fail in a big dramatic explosion. It often erodes away a little bit at a time, and we start taking these shortcuts and we start normalizing this deviation from our standard. When that happens, and we rely on close calls and routine risk taking, that's when we are starting to rely on luck. And if you're relying on luck in health and safety, you're in the wrong place.
Yeah, odds are against you.
Very much.
Yeah.
And I don't think people realize
This
that.
luck runs out.
Yeah.
Always.
Don't say that. I'm going to go gamble tonight.
Know your limits. Stay with them.
Yeah, exactly. No, those are great. And I would, to tack on to what you're talking about, Jill, like there's a lot of organizations that have one safety person, and they're unfortunately there as a resource that doesn't get listened to or doesn't get used.
Because they have to do the safety, and that's wrong.
Well, and it interferes with production, or it interferes with project management or timelines. We don't have an extra hour to do safety stuff to complete this. We have to complete it in our 5-hour window or a 1-day window or whatever it might be. And so, I always encourage people who end up in that spot to maybe say to themselves, this might not be the right company for you. If you're uncomfortable with what's going on, it's time to maybe look to the outside world for another opportunity, and you'll eventually find an organization that has the same mindset as you. And more organizations are slowly shifting from reactive to proactive. And it's taken some time. It's taken a lot of effort by good people like the two of you to sort of force the hand of some of these organizations. But when the bigger organizations do it, the smaller companies get pulled along with it, which is what we're starting to see right now is, a bigger uptick in organizations that are saying, okay, you know what? It's not just enough that we have core. We actually need this program that aren't really covered as part of core, because we want to go work for EPCOR, or we want to go work for the city of Edmonton, or we want to go work for the city of Calgary, or whatever municipality or government or bigger organization, ACO, to do this type of work. So yeah, no, really good. And I would like to thank the two of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.